Dear audience, welcome to the third day of our public discussions, Wartime Documentation, Literature, Memoirs and Testimonies. We welcome our audience in person as well as our online viewers. Welcome. This event is organized by the National University of Kyiv-Mogila Academy and is held right here. And before we start our today's panel, I would like to make a small fundraiser announcement, as it's very important for us as a university community which is based in Ukraine, in Kyiv, to support those who serve in the front lines and defend us all, and due to whom we have possibility to have these discussions. And now we are watching a small video. This is the address of our graduate Timur, who is now in the front lines, and then we will translate his address for our English-speaking audience.
Шановні викладачі та співробітники наукма, дорогі студенти та випускники, люба могилянська родина. Я, Тимур Плющ, колишній студент факультету економічних наук Національного університету Києво-Могилянська академія, а тепер військовослужбовець 24-ї окремої механізованої бригади імені короля Данила, яка виконує свої задачі на Горлівському напрямку. І зараз я відчуваю, що мені надзвичайно не вистачає багатьох елементів нашої спільноти, інтелектуального середовища, палких академічних дискусій, затишних посиденьок в бібліотеці, підготовки до семінарів з друзями, атмосфери подолу і відчуття золотої свободи, аурум лібертас. Але, на жаль, найбільше мені не вистачає квадроцикла для виконання бойових завдань. Тому я щиро прошу всю спільноту підтримати наш могилянський збір на квадроцикл CF Moto. І вірю, що ми ще неодмінно зустрінемося в наших стінах. Разом до перемоги, слава Україні і частинний Києво-Могилянська академія вічна.
And now I'm honored to read the translation of Timur's speech. Dear Naukma professors and staff, dear students and alumni, dear Naukma family. I'm Timur Plющ, a former student of the economics faculty at the National University of Kyiv-Mogila Academy, now serving in the King Danilo 24th Special Mechanized Brigade, which is currently deployed in the Horlivka area. I now feel how I miss many elements of our Naukma community, its intellectual surroundings, intense academic discussions, relaxed get-togethers in the library, preparing seminars with friends, the atmosphere of the Podil, and the feeling of a golden freedom, aurum libertas. But unfortunately, I am now in most need of a quadricycle for fulfilling our military operations. That is why I'm asking our entire community to support the Naukma drive to purchase a CF Moto ATV. I firmly believe that we will meet again within the walls of our academy. Together to victory. Glory to Ukraine. Tempus fugit. Time is fleeting. The Kyiv-Mogila Academy is eternal.
Thank you, Roman. And we will place the ways how you can support Timur to our chat and to our Facebook page where this stream is going on. And now my pleasure and honor to introduce to you our moderator, Bohdana Neborak. Bohdana Neborak is a journalist and editor based in Kyiv. Educated as a lawyer, Bohdana has 10 years of experience in media and cultural institutions. In her work, she focuses on culture and its influences on society. She is currently working on issues of imperialism and colonialism in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the discovery of how culture reflects these issues, and on how the war is changing the cultural field. Drawing on her experience in cultural diplomacy and management, Bohdana also runs a podcast on culture and researchers, the connection between reading practices and democratic processes. So, Bohdana, the floor is yours. thank you for being us and enjoy our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. And it is a big pleasure for me to greet our audience online and offline here at Kyiv-Mogila Academy. I want to start from the idea of the dialogue and questions. You are able to pose your questions to our speakers. So take this opportunity and listen carefully. And I kindly introduce our today's speakers who are in person with us, who are Veretelnyk and Myroslav Laiuk. And we also have Ed Vulliamy, who is with us online. So I also want to briefly remind our agenda. We have several speakers, and for each of them we have around 15 minutes for the speech. And then we will have time for the dialogue and the discussion. So at this event, for 3 days already, we have been speaking about wartime literature, testimonies, and memoir. And today is not the exception. So I hope we will have a good intellectual discussion. And I want to start from Ed Vulliamy. And first of all, I need to introduce you him. Ed Vulliamy is a journalist, and he is a graduate in politics and philosophy from Hertford College, Oxford. He covered the Romanian Revolution, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Oklahoma City bombings, the September 11 attacks, and the Iraq War as a reporter of The Guardian and The Observer. He covered the wars in the former Yugoslavia, in Bosnia, the Secret War, an award-winning retrospective series of articles, and made Bosnia's Last Testament, which is a personal television essay for the BBC. In 1996, Ed Vulliamy became the first journalist to testify for the prosecution at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague. Since 2022, he has frequently visited Ukraine and written about Russia's war against Ukraine and the role of music in wartime. 2018 saw the publication of his memoir, When Words Fail, A Life with Music, War, and Peace. He is also the author of The War is Dead, Long Live the War, from 2014, about the survivors of Bosnia's rape and concentration camps. And today's Ed's speech is entitled Words on the Page, Words Before the Court. Ed, the floor is yours.
Дуже дякую. Добрий вечір, Київ. Слава Україні. Я намагаюся вивчити українську, але це дуже важко. So I'm going to do this in English. Maybe next year in Ukrainian.
Героям слава.
Thank you, Bohdana. Well, I'm going to basically combine, if I can. Bohdana is a journalist who trained in law. So that's going to be my focus, in fact, journalism and the law and journalism, writing and testimony. And thank you for the introduction, because it saves me having to explain basically that I was in this war, which we'll talk about. It was fought. It wasn't really a war. It was a slaughterhouse, and it happened before many of you were even thought about. So I'll go over that later. But let me start with a little anecdote. As a journalist, I prefer stories to pontification. Basically, this is day one of the very first trial of the first series of war crimes trials since Nuremberg, since the Nuremberg courts in Germany at the end of the Second World War. And it's the witness room. And it's extraordinary because I found these concentration camps and rape camps in 1992 and exposed them in a gulag of camps in which the Bosnian Serbs were keeping mostly Bosniak Muslim and some Catholic Croat prisoners, inmates, for systematic rape, mutilation, murder, torture, and execution. The lucky ones were ethnically cleansed, as as the Serbs themselves put it, into their government-held territory. A bit like the people who have survived the invasions of 2014 and recently, making it alive and safely to the free Ukrainian territory, I suppose. They're the lucky ones, in a way. But this is day one. And it was extraordinary because there were people who I had last seen as prisoners in the camp. And they're picking rather nervously at breakfast 4 years later in a rather smart Dutch business hotel. And the witness room is full of smoke. In those days, you could smoke in hotels. And everybody's nervous. Everyone's going to testify. And it was day one. It was a big day. And I was quite, idealistic about it all, and hopeful that this would come to some kind of reckoning, and we'll get to that word later. But if not reckoning, justice. And most of the survivors of the camps were saying, "How much money is lawyer making for me tell my story? How much money is the lawyer getting?" And I thought this was a little sort of churlish at first. I thought, hang on, wait, it's the higher cause of international justice. But that was what worried them most, even more than having to appear before the court. Who's making money out of me? And I thought that was it turned out that 30 years later, they were right. But let me start at sort of at the beginning. Many of my generation of journalists were sort of baptized by fire, either in the America's dirty wars in Central America, in El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua, or in Bosnia-Herzegovina 10 years later. I was one of the latter. And we, as a group of people, we both learned a lot about genocidal violence in those places. There were a lot of differences and a lot of similarities between Bosnia, what happened in Bosnia, and what is happening now in your country's heroic struggle for survival and thereafter freedom and independence and sovereignty. We can get to those later, but they both had one thing in common, really, and that it was the axis between Moscow and Belgrade. And in as much as Belgrade is Mali Moscow, little Moscow, and Milosevic, the Serbian leader, is kind of little Putin, I often think that Bosnia was, in a way, the maquette, and what you are facing in Ukraine, in your country now, is the statue. We as reporters did our best those 3 bloody, awful years between 1992, when I found the camps, and 1995, when the war was ended in a way that Ukraine must avoid, because a treaty was imposed, and the aggressors got pretty much everything they wanted, and bullied and raped and killed for. In other words, everything that your brave country must resist from the international community was imposed on Bosnia. And that followed some of you may have heard of it, the massacre at Srebrenica of 8,000 men and boys by summary execution, Muslim Bosnians summarily executed by the Serbs in 5 days, literally at the court, which we're going to get to later. One of the very few people to testify against his own former officers described a scene where the executioners asked if they could sit down because they were so tired. Next. And they said, "Can we do this sitting in a chair, please? It's so exhausting." We did our work as best we could to record where we now know with hindsight to have been war crimes, crimes against humanity, and in some cases, in the case of Srebrenica, it was judged in breach of the Genocide Convention. But at the time, we didn't really know this. And the reason I'm going to talk about Bosnia for the next, what is now, I think, 12 minutes, is not because I want to talk to you about a war that happened 35 years ago, or, God forbid, because I'm an old journalist banging on about things I've done to a largely young Ukrainian audience. I want to do so hoping that this might be of interest, if not some use to those of you, because, to some of you, because to entwine Bohdana's 2 disciplines of journalism and law, we were doing this work, not really knowing at the time that these were crimes against humanity, breaches of the laws of war, breaches of the Genocide Convention. We were reporting our stories, for the newspapers, for the television. There was not really internet or social media in those days, which is hard to understand. It made life both easier and harder. And it made the truth harder to establish as well. Sorry, harder now. It was easier to establish the truth then. But basically, we didn't think in the terms of war crimes or crimes against humanity. We thought in terms of a genocide, an outrage. We believed passionately as a group of people. It was didactic. We weren't neutral. We believed that military intervention from the West would stop the slaughter. It was not forthcoming. The West sold Bosnia to the wolves in a way that it must not do in Ukraine, and is so far not really doing to Ukraine. The West is backing Ukraine in a way that it did not back the Bosnians, but we were doing it for the sake of as journalists. Two things happened. It was only 4 years after the war ended that my dear friend and colleague David Reef, who was speaking a couple of days ago here, and another colleague of ours called Roy Gutman, did a book called Crimes of War. And what they did was to take stories from a number of us journalists, many, if not most of whom had worked in Bosnia, to demonstrate the laws of war and the breaches thereof with our stories, making a connection between journalism and testimony before the court, if you like. By then, the court was up and running, and my whole, for what it's worth, personal relationship to journalism had changed completely in a way that I recognize now in Ukraine, because all these wonderful young journalists going around in the up and down the dangerous front lines, reporting on culture-cide, genocide, femicide, and all the other things that the Russians are throwing at you to try and obliterate your country and culture, and the resistance there too. When I speak to young journalists in Ukraine, almost all of them are doing two things at once. They are working for their newspapers, for their TV, for their videos, for their social media that I don't really understand. But they also are very aware, in my experience anyway, that one day what they are testifying to, or rather the testimony that they are testifying to, if you see what I mean, may one day be used in a court of law. And that is new, that is different, and that's not what we were doing. We, as a group of journalists working in Bosnia, were not really recording testimony for a court, but it turned out that that's exactly what I was doing, because in 1996, 3 years before, sorry, 1995, 3 years, 4 years before the book, I got a call from the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, which was set up by the UN to try crimes against humanity and war crimes, partly in contrition for the miserable failure of the UN to protect the victims, I don't like the word victims, to protect the Bosnians from the genocidal slaughter. In fact, if anything, they aided and abetted it. The Srebrenica massacre was facilitated by the United Nations. But you know, and in part, I am given to understand because it was a response to the concentration camps, which it had been my accursed honor to find. So I suddenly found, and this is my theme really, that all my notebooks were suddenly being requested by the court, and were now being entered into evidence for the prosecution. Now, I have to say, not many of us were doing this. And I'm going to get to that later. There was huge resistance from within the newspaper industry. And most American reporters thought it was not their role to testify in court because it would jeopardize their neutrality. And I want to get on to what I regard as that pernicious argument later. But I thought it was the best I could do at the time, to be honest. So suddenly all these notebooks with my, I do a thing called T-line shorthand, which you can do at 120 words a minute, which is evidence in court. I didn't record anything. I never do. I just use my shorthand. That is considered valid testimony. Longhand is not, by the way. but most people of your generation record stuff now electronically, which is, of course, evidence. Suddenly, it's all testimony. And I am face to face in court with mass murderers, the commanders of mass murderers. I meet again years later the people on whose weird, perverse authority we got passed to get into the camps in the first place. We'd met in 1992 in the middle of the war, in the middle of the violence and the ethnic cleansing and the mass murder. And now we met again across a courtroom. And I was testifying for the prosecution. So these two things came together. Now, what I'd like to throw out is just a few ideas regarding why they are not the same thing. And why they are the same thing. There's a stylistic point that I'd like to make. One is that I hate the word victim. In French, by the way, if you say that someone is une victime or une victime, they are by definition dead. We use victim as synonymous with survivor sometimes. I don't like that word. And I think as journalists and writers, it's very important that we don't define people by the crime. That is an individual. They are not what was done to them. It matters who their parents were, who their children are, who they are, what their name is, where they live, who they are. That is who it is. That's the person who has survived the attempt to obliterate them. Whereas, and when we write prose or stories, I think we must also be very careful, not to define a person by the crime. But of course, in a court of law, it doesn't matter whether what that person's name is, even virtually. It doesn't matter whether they're Dinamo or Shakhtar, how many children they've got, which kind of music they like. It doesn't matter. All that matters is what's done to them. So the two, as it were, the two forms of testimony, journalistic and legal, become immediately different when it comes to the individual. And here's another problem before we get into the nitty-gritty of the trials and my experience with the trials for what it's worth. It's the question of time. Time and war have a very strange relationship. Time and survival have a very strange relationship. The suicides of people who survived the Holocaust happened decades after the liberation of the Nazi death camps. People like Primo Levi, Borowski, Jean Améry, many others. Time is not the healer. And time is also, well, time is the essence of a journalist's job. When the editor says, or when you find something that has to be reported, that is an atrocity, it needs reporting, you're working for your newspaper, for your television station, for whatever, for your documentary film, and there is a deadline. Life is what it is in this business. But if you're gathering testimony for the court, very, very few, if any, people will testify to what has happened to them on a first, a second, not even a third, or fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th meeting. Gathering information that is going to be watertight in a courtroom is a completely different process. The book that Bohdana very kindly referred to about Bosnia, The War is Dead, Long Live the War, is exactly that, because the war may end, but it goes on and on and on. And for those who survive it, it never really ends. And that book actually took me, sounds ridiculous, but took me 20 years to write, on and off. And the reason for that is that, particularly when it came to the case of violated women testifying to a male reporter, it takes years before that person is able, let alone prepared, to actually talk about what happened to them on the record for a text which can then be sent back to them for them to clear for publication. Now, that's literature rather than journalism, one might argue, just because of the time it takes. I mean, no one can call 20 years journalism, really. But when these same people who are in my book are dealing with the prosecution lawyers in court, what you see in the courtroom is actually the result of a long period of prep, of preparation. A good prosecution lawyer spends weeks with a witness before putting them on the stand. Now, there is a difference because the lawyers don't make friends with these people. I don't know any survivor of the concentration camps or the rape camps or the death camps who made any long-lasting friendship with any of the prosecution lawyers. But it's my great honor to count many of those people among my close personal friends. In fact, one of them is actually terminally ill from some of the wounds he received in the camp 35 years ago, and I'm going to go and visit him before it's too late next week, indeed, just outside London. It's that intense. Why does do the lawyers need to take this kind of time differently from we as journalists, because we actually take these people seriously and they become friends? Well, it's called cross-examination, and I think that when you good people, you estimable, wonderful, brave, and diligent journalists are going out to gather information that you know that you hope is going to be put before a court one day. Do remember this: there's going to be a very well-paid, very expert Russian lawyer who's going to go through everything you're saying and everything you've got with a fine-tooth comb, and whose sole aim is to destroy your reputation, your story, your testimony. And they're good. I had the Serbs. You'll get the Russians. They know what they're doing. They are evil. They are defending a cause, not a client often. But they know what they're doing. And testimony is no fun. Sometimes I testified in 10 trials, 9 of them against the Bosnian Serbs, 1 against the Bosnian Croats, all of them for what I thought it was genocide. By the way, we'll get to that. Srebrenica was the only massacre in Bosnia that was actually ruled genocide. Genocide is incredibly hard to prove, and the prosecutions could not prove it, even in the concentration camps. Even in the towns where every school, every mosque, every Catholic church was incinerated, everybody was expelled, they still couldn't prove genocide, to the annoyance of many of the survivors, in fact, all of them, to the outrage of the survivors. But, I testified in these trials, and you start off with the little guys, torturers, rapists, killers, and you go up the chain of command right to the top. I testified against President Milosevic, who was the architect of all this, and his 2 sort of senior henchmen, the military commander of the Bosnian Serbs, a man called Mladic, and his completely crazy and sadistic political opposite, a man called Karadzic. I testified against them and a lot of people in between, many of whom I had met personally across tabletops during the war. It was very strange. But you're on the stand for 3 days. You're not going to sleep beforehand, in between. You may, if you take a sleeping pill, you're going to be dozy in court. If you don't take one, you're not going to sleep because you're too wired up and nervous. And that cross-examination lawyer is going to try everything he or she can to get you. So be aware of that. Everything has to be, truer than true, watertight, and verifiable by all the other witnesses. Because what they do is they find holes in between the testimony between different people. But hang on, you said the house was over there. But so it's all this. It's grotesque. It's how the law works. Bohdana knows that only too well. So there are some of the issues. Now there are going to be some differences. Bohdana, another 2 or 3 minutes. Is that okay?
Okay, 2 minutes, and then we go on.
Okay,
we will
we're going to get to the end of this.
Questions.
You've got a lot of things to think about in Ukraine that's different from Bosnia. There's the ICC. They're working on it. You've got to work out to what degree trials in absentia will suit you. The difference is that Serbia was trying to get on the list of entry into the European Union. The deal was they had to hand over their people. So they did what Russia will never do, which is to hand people over to the court. Although Russia may be forced to, you've got to think about the value of your national courts. and you've got to have a think about what you can do with the International Court of Justice, whereby Ukraine can do what South Africa is doing with Israel. You can put Russia on trial for genocide at the International Court of Justice. But just to sum up, what the relationship between the two. I was attacked. I was pulled over the coals by the New York Times, a woman called Nina Bernstein, who gave a completely false notion of what it was for a journalist to testify in a court. She said, I handed over my notebooks to the prosecution. No, I didn't. The prosecution, to the defense. No, I didn't. The defense sometimes demanded access to pages, and they were very carefully arranged so they wouldn't see the names of contacts and things. There was a constituency of opinion that said that I was betraying my neutrality as a journalist. Now, this is crucial. Objectivity is our rule book. Objective is fact specific. This happened. If there's 15 bodies, it's 15 bodies. It doesn't matter if they're Ukrainian or Russian, Israeli or Gazan, Yemeni or Ethiopian or whatever. It doesn't matter. That's fact specific. Fact is fact. Truth is truth. And there's too much ideological playing around with fact. It happened, and you know it happened because you saw it. But neutrality is something else. Neutrality is an equilibrium. I'm not neutral between the Russian aggression against Ukraine and Ukraine's resistance to exist. I'm not neutral between the women who were raped in the Omarska concentration camp that I found and the thugs who were raping her. No, that's a moral judgment, and that I think is where we've got journalistic, we've got legal, and incomes at the end is where moral. It is our moral duty to testify to the truth in whatever court of justice is doing its best to prosecute these people. Did The Hague achieve anything at the end? I think it probably did, in terms of, to use the words of the title of this series, testimony. I think actually The Hague achieved what it achieved for historical reasons. The story was told. Legally, no. And I'll leave you with this. The head of the Serbian Secret Services, a man called Perisic, he was finally convicted after innumerable appeals last year. That's 30 years. So if you were, the equivalent would be if you were a survivor of Mariupol or a violated woman in Bucha at the age of 30, you get justice at the age of 60. That's not enough. That's not good enough. There's a saying: justice delayed is justice denied. So I'm not sure I would do it again, but I do urge you to think in these terms of the laws of what you do as reporters in terms of the laws of war. And in the end, as per the people with smoking nervously in the witness room on day one, they were right. The lawyers made an absolute effing fortune out of this, and I think that's wrong. Thank you very much indeed for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Ed, for your observations and especially of what you speak about the difference of how Ukrainian journalists work right now. I think that we will have enough space to develop this topic in our discussion session. But for now, let me introduce you our second speaker, who is Roman Veretelnyk. Roman Veretelnyk is a chair of Volodymyr Moranets Department of Literature, and he holds a PhD in literary studies. His scientific focus is Lesa Ukrainka, also the period of the Ukrainian 60s, and also he researched the poetry of Vasil Stus. Today, Roman Veretelnyk will speak about the children's reception of the war narratives. And Roman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bohdana. Excuse me. Thank you again, Bohdana, and thank you very much, Ed. Thank you for your professionalism. Thank you for your passion. And most of all, thanks for being with us in these years of our need. It's very meaningful.
It's a privilege. It's a privilege, Roman. It's an honor.
Thanks, Ed.
You're leading us the way. You're showing us the way in Ukraine.
Your example is unbelievable.
Your example.
I'll begin with my talk will be somewhat impressionistic rather than scholarly, although it will have I will be quoting scholars. I think everyone who comes to this university knows that during air raid alerts, Contract Square Metro is full of school kids. And it's always just such an incredible scene to exit the car of the metro and to see hundreds of kids who are sitting in the metro, running around and not knowing what will happen next, along with a lot of other people who find themselves there. Now I'd like to quote someone. Here's the quote. On the one hand, Putin stole childhood from our children. But on the other hand, each of us should make sacrifices for the sake of our country. Our children have sacrificed their childhood. Quite a chilling thought. The quote is from President Volodymyr Zelensky, speaking with David Letterman, an American comedian who conducted an interview with him here in the metro, at the Independence Square metro. And Ed, thanks for talking about how years matter, how decades can pass before something is really known or comes to light, and how the experience of the kids that Mr. Zelensky was talking about will translate into narratives 10, 20, 30 years from now is an unknown. Yesterday, poet and Marine Irina Chornohuz spoke about her secret world. And her secret world, she pours it out into poetry. And she was saying that in her poetry, she can say things that she doesn't even share with her brothers and sisters in arms. And I'm thinking here about, again, our children and their secrets. Usually we live in a world, including right now, where children's voices are not heard very often. We even tell them to be quiet. How many times do we tell our children to be quiet? But they have their secrets, and they have their knowledge of the war that is being articulated by them. And I'll complete this quote. We don't have to tell kids anything about our victory. Trust me. They know much more about the war than we do. I'm saying this very frankly. My son is 9 years old. He knows the names of all the weapons, and he didn't learn this from me. They are deeply immersed in this war. That is President Zelensky completing his quote. And on a personal note, I can add to this type of thinking. In the fall of 21, before the full-scale invasion, I was taking my grandson, who was, I believe, 8 years old at the time, from school. And we were walking this beautiful fall day, and my grandson, Askol, asks me, can we go to the bomb shelter? And I was stunned. What bomb shelter? And he went on to say, there was a soldier in our classroom today. And he told us that we should know where bomb shelters are. And what's going to happen if they throw atomic bombs at us? And I was saying, Askol, no one will be throwing bombs at us. The more so atomic bombs. And I sort of laughed it off. And here was this child with this knowledge of having heard the soldier, of transforming that knowledge into something very real. And of course, 3 or 4 months later, that night did come where the bombs and rockets fell. And later, after sometime in late February, after the full scale, I remember walking with Askold on Saksahanskoe Street here in the center of Kyiv, and there was a soldier walking in front of us, and we could hear the blasts from the Irpin and Bucha area. It was quite loud. And we're walking along, and Askold says, that's artillery. And the soldier looked at us, and I'll never forget the look on his face when he looked at this child who, by that time, knew what artillery sounds like. And I think this was what President Zelensky was talking about when he was talking about his son and knowing the weaponry without him having to tell him what it is. There is a movie playing right now in Ukrainian movie theaters, and it's called Felix and I. It's about the 1990s. It's a growing up story, and it's one of the very few Ukrainian movies that is about kids and their psychology. I can't think of another movie, really, of that kind that is sort of being seen by so many people. And it's about an Afghan war veteran who comes to live with a family. He becomes the boyfriend of the little boy's grandmother. She brings him home, and at their first dinner together, it's quite an awkward moment, and the Afghan war veteran Felix is saying that he spent 8 years in Afghanistan fighting the war, and the boy, Timofey, asks him, "Did you kill people?" And Felix looks at the boy and he says, "Yes." And the remarkable thing about those lines are the actor playing Timofey, his name is Andrei Chilik, and he was improvising. That wasn't in the script. And to add to that sort of virtuality of that, his father, Andrei's father, Artem Chekh, who wrote a novel on which the movie is based, was a soldier in the Ukrainian army since 2014. And after the full scale, he re-enlisted and is now also at the front. So it's this fiction meets non-fiction in what was happening, what happens in that movie. And to add to this story, in her review of the movie, probably Ukraine's most celebrated author today, Oksana Zabushko, mentions that this story should have been told by my generation, not the generation of the film director who made the movie, Irina Chilik, who is a millennial. And but that movie wasn't made. The Afghan war was never really talked about in the Ukrainian context. And there were a lot of stories that were never talked about. And now this story is coming out. So my thoughts are, our kids today who are witnessing this awful, brutal war, the stories that they will tell 20 years from now and 30 years from now will be the stories of what they're feeling now, but not really having the apparatus to talk about so far, although I'll get into that because they really are. Just one sec. Now, these stories, this is not a remote story of something, again, what Ed was talking about, something being told much later. For instance, Dmytro Stus, the son of Vasil Stus, a Ukrainian poet and dissident who was killed in the Mordovian labor camps in the 1980s. Dmytro edits a book of his father's letters in the 2000s, and he calls the book Letters to My Son. These were the letters that Vasil Stus wrote to his son because he couldn't be with him. And at a conference here at our university, another Ukrainian dissident and scholar, Yevhen Sverstyuk, was talking about how the prisoners in those camps were trying to educate their kids from thousands of kilometers away. And one of the ways they were doing it they were translating Rudyard Kipling's If. In Vasil Stus's translation, Yakщо. No, sorry, that's Yevhen Sverstyuk's. In Stus's, it's Synovi, to my son. And Sverstyuk was saying it was simple. All of us wanted to be with our children, but we couldn't be with them. So we wrote them letters, we translated poems, and Kipling was a wonderful vehicle, Kipling's If. And that came out again 20 years after Stus was killed. And another story that I'll mention, again, sort of a narrative delayed. There is a Ukrainian Nobel Prize winner from Western Ukraine, Raoul Hoffman. He won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry, and he was born in Western Ukraine, close to the city of Lviv, in a little town, and he was saved by people who hid him and his family in an attic of a school. His teacher's name was Mykola Duke, and the little boy was saved. He was 5 years old at the time. His father was killed in the Holocaust. He managed to leave. He was helped to leave with his mother. He ended up in the States. He grew up in the States. He became a scholar. He was given the Nobel Prize. He never forgot his story. In 2015, he writes a play called Something That Belongs to You. The play is about his Ukrainian past. Something like 40 years after the fact, or whatever. I don't have my calculator with me right now. And in 2014, when the Maidan, the revolution of dignity, as we call it, right? When it occurred, he supported Ukraine. He went on Ukrainian television saying, I'll never forget you. And when 2022 came around, I don't know what the word would be. He got 167 Nobel laureates together, and they all signed a collective letter in the support of Ukraine. So these are these stories, narratives delayed, that sometimes can have amazing results. Now, my grandson Askold, who I mentioned, belongs to what's been given the name the Alpha generation. These are kids born after 2010. They ran out of XYZ, so there was nowhere to go. They had to go back to the Greek alphabet, so they started with Alpha. Then there will be Beta, etc., right? So Askold belongs to the Alpha generation, and let's think about this. This generation is the first generation that's grown up with smartphones as something that's normal and expected. I remember Askold asking me once, what, there was a life without smartphones? And I said, yes, there was a life without smartphones. This is a generation that was growing up in school with COVID. To them, online is the new normal. For us, it's abnormal, right? And we often complain, oh no, we have to go online. For these kids, it's normal. Right? And their sort of friendship, if we can put it that way, with technology is organic. To them, this technology is something that they can't imagine a world without, right? And David Reef, when he was speaking on the first day, he was mentioning that Ukraine's war right now is World War I trenches and Star Wars mixed together. If I'm thinking of the technologies of today and today's kids, it's like skipping centuries. I don't know who remembers the movie 2001, this remarkable film of the 1960s. And there's a scene where prehistoric human throws up a bone, the bone spins in the air, and when it's coming down, the bone is transformed into a space vessel orbiting the Earth. A remarkable editing trick, if you want to put it that way, all to the sounds of The Blue Danube by Strauss. And if we think about the movie by Irina Chilik again, and if we think of the little boy in the 1990s, what was his sort of thing of greatest value? It was a pair of sneakers, right? That's what was stolen from him. That was what he had. Today, Generation Alpha is called the iPad generation. Today, they would be stealing the little boy's iPad or cellular phone, right? Not his sneakers. And today in the movie, if you see it, Felix's Kalashnikov in his briefcase would be, it wouldn't be a Kalashnikov anymore. It would be a drone that he's carrying. And so we've skipped almost a century in 2 decades. It's something to think about. as to how time passes and what this generation has grown up with, and what they know as life as it is, which adults sometimes think that all this is sort of abnormal. I don't know how much time I have, Bohdana, but I'd like to quote Marshall McLuhan. Again, David was talking about... And just a quote from Marshall McLuhan, the great media theorist of the 20th century. Everything is changing. You, your family, your neighborhood, your education, your job, your government, and they're changing dramatically. Youth instinctively understands the present environment, the electric drama. Instead of the family circle or the school being the basis of education, character no longer is shaped by only two earnest, fumbling experts. Now all the world's a sage. This is a pun, of course, a Shakespearean pun. Today's TV child is attuned to the adult news and is bewildered when he enters the 19th century environment that still characterizes the educational environment. Today's child is growing up absurd because he lives in two worlds. And this is McLuhan saying this in 1967. This is at our generation, kids, that McLuhan is talking about. I don't know what he would say about today's iPad generation. And so Generation Alpha that grew up with these smartphones, the internet, COVID, the online world. Now, add to all of this in Ukraine, the war, which is continuing the online world for Ukrainian kids. Whereas, for instance, kids in the UK or in North America or in Europe can now start going back to a normal existence after COVID. Our kids can't. They're continuing the online. And speaking to Askold again recently, because some parents are saying, well, you kids, you spend too much time with your cell phones. I think there's a statistic from North America that a child spends 7 hours a day on their smartphone, right? And Askold says, how else can I communicate with my friends? Right? How can I socialize with my friends if I don't communicate with them on my cell phone? Right? And of course, he's right. I'll be ending soon. Now, what does this communication consist of for these kids? They have private chat rooms. They're on social media. They're on video games like Roblox, Brawl Stars. There are all kinds of YouTube videos. One of the most recent viral ones is, I don't know if anyone here has heard of this video, Skibbity Toilets. Not a very nice sounding sort of name for a video, but it's incredibly viral and popular with kids. Now, all of these things are relatively violent. And you're thinking, sometimes we're in the corridor with Askold when his mother is working at the news station, and Hala and I are in the corridor with Askold, and we can hear the explosions on the outside, and here is Askold playing video games that are violent, that are simulating real violence. And I mean, the thing is so surreal, I don't even know how to comment. Do parents, educators fear all of this? Of course they do. And there are all kinds of dangers. Dependence, kids read less outdoor activities, dangers of the online world, predators, manipulations, things like that. It's a dangerous world out there, but the kids are maneuvering it. And on the other hand, all these things are vehicles, again, for communication and for learning. So I'd like to mention controversial scholar Bruno Bettelheim, a psychologist who wrote a book called The Uses of Enchantment. He wrote about fairy tales in the lives of children. And his main point was, when kids are reading fairy tales, don't tell them how to interpret fairy tales. Don't tell them how to interpret death. Don't tell them how to interpret tragedy. Let them find these things for themselves. We like to interpret for them. We like to tell them, don't do this, don't do that. Right? Bettelheim says, let the kid work on this himself, right? And here this talk that I'm ending very quickly could be called not how do we talk to kids about the war, but how do we listen to kids about the war? What do they have to tell us about the war, right? So I won't go on because there's still more. Just one or two things. For instance, we also fear profanity. And when I first heard this, I was a bit concerned when Askold was mentioning something, and he mentioned it for a number of weeks after the full scale. Glory to the nation, fuck the Russian Federation. And I mean, it sounds great, and I share his feeling, of course, but a kid's not supposed to say this. But on the other hand, what am I going to say to the kid, right? And things like that, right? Now, in my talk, and I'm really ending now, I didn't mention all the things that are going on. Writers are writing books for kids. There are all kinds of fascinating projects. Libraries are being renewed. There are seminars being held, again, as to how how we should be talking to kids. There's fantastic projects like the Barabuka project of Ukrainian children's writers. I know that Ed has been working with the Kherson Library to help them out, and that's been a fantastic project. And Ed's mother was the celebrated children's writer Shirley Hughes, so I know he's very deeply concerned with what happens to reading and books in this war. But in my talk, what I wanted to just intimate at was this secret world of the kids and how they're communicating with us. If we listen, we'll hear them.
Thank you, Roman, for this very powerful and moving input into our conference. And I think that it is very important to raise such topic amidst the war, amidst the genocidal war, because we see how the life goes on, and we need to find ways to emphasize these stories. So thank you again very much. We are moving on, and I would like to introduce you our next speaker, who is Myroslav Laiuk. Myroslav is a PhD in literature, and he is a writer. He authored several books of prose and poetry. But right after the full-scale invasion of Russia, he started to work as a documentarian, and he worked in the east, in the war zone. He also covered Kherson and the explosion of Dam. He covered the outskirts of Kyiv and the liberated territories of Ukraine and the stories of people from there. So, Myroslav, I introduce you, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, hi everyone. Just please wait a second, because I have a lot of photos. Okay, let's begin. It's an honor for me to be here. Before the full-scale invasion, I was a writer. I wrote novels and poetry, researched and taught literature at the university in Kyivo-Mogilянська Academy. Before that, I had no experience as a documentarian since the beginning of the invasion. I decided that I should do it, and I began to study this subject. What I'm going to talk about today is mostly based on my experience. This is related to the book Bakhmut, articles from the flooded Kherson last year, and also from another areas of the front line where I went. Sorry, I forgot to keep a copy of book. Maybe you will find it online. When we talk about the forms of fixation of war actions, soldiers and civilian emotions, my experience is related to text. Also, sometimes I am working with photos and videos. I will try to show you some videos. The photos that you see are the photos by Danilo Paulo. Why sometimes I'm working with photos and videos? Because some material could be better presented through images. First of all, I want to tell you about the experience of writing the book Bakhmut. So on December 31 in 2022, photographer Danilo Paulo and I came to Bakhmut to show how the New Year's Eve is celebrated in a half-ruined city. One of our heroine, Mrs. Alexandra, she was 86 years old. She's standing in the yard of the burned city center. And new chapter of the story begins from a photo by her, of her. A Ukrainian woman from Canada saw a picture of her mother, our Mrs. Alexander later. In our article about the New Year's Eve in Bakhmut, we had a video conversation, and she asked me if I returned to Bakhmut to evacuate her mother from the city. In mid-March 2023, we are going to the Bakhmut direction again. Shortly before the red zone, I received a message from Canada. My mother has been injured. She is now being taken to the hospital in Kostyantynivka. Kostyantynivka is a city or big town 20 kilometers from Bakhmut. And this is the beginning of the story. This is the beginning of the book, because if you have a book, you need a big story, not just several small stories. Yes, you need also small stories, but you need some story that is a spine of the whole story. And this is the beginning of the story. At that time, we went to the east of the country to write a big report for the magazine and to make this panoramic view of this battle for Bakhmut, because the Russians were already in the city. At that time, we went to different positions, to different branches of army, to different brigades. For example, we spent a lot of time, and there are a lot of photos from 24th Brigade. The guy who make a preface for our conversation today, Timur, is from this brigade. And for example, we spent a day and a night with infantrymen from the 3rd Brigade. At one point, I read the news that a guy from the 93rd Brigade, you may know it, this brigade, it's really famous, and the guy from this brigade shot down a Russian fighter jet, and soon I met this guy. However, in addition to the ordinary military, we spent time with chaplains, for example. The military also allowed us to talk with 2 Russian prisoners of war. One of them is from Wagner Group, was from Wagner Group. We also got to the evacuation point, followed the car with the ambulance with wounded and dead soldiers to the stabilization point. And can I give you this? Please show just black and white photos, and after that I will ask you to show us the photos with more colors. Okay. When I returned to Kyiv, I realized that the amount of this important information is much bigger than the amount of a big article. After returning to Kyiv, I also began to recall many moments from Bakhmut to reflect. So I wrote several essays. So we decided it should be a book. The first part of it is called Fixation. And there's pieces from the middle of winter and the beginning of spring of 2023 on the eve of the capture of this place by Russians and its total destruction. The second part is called commentary, and these are the essays. Some of them, for example, tell the history of Bakhmut, the influence of Soviet heritage, and so on. It is also a reflection on the children, yes, we were talking about the children. And these children are not only the children who are in Kyiv, in Lviv, something like this. These children are still lived in the city during the war. And I think that a lot of them are now also in some basements. And it's really children of war, for me, is one of the most horrible stories there. Other essays are really personal because, for example, one of the essays is about my university roommate, Zhenya Osiyevsky. You may know him. He was a student in Kyivo-Mogilянська Academy, and he was killed in action in this city 1 year ago. If we talk about forms of fixation, I noticed that when we write a reportage, literary journalism, you almost don't want to give a reflection. You become only your eyes and your ears. However, over time, you start recalling various details that begin to form some additional systems. For example, one of the essays is called Nails, just Nails. There I describe how military women returning to combat from combat missions go to a manicure master. Yeah, they just want to feel like they are in so-called normal life. Yes, at least for a few days of rest, 3-5 days of rest, because after that they will have another military missions. And also, I understood that when we write an essay, it's also a form of fixation, because we fix the moment of our thoughts at this time, at time of war. And please show not white and black photos from Kherson. If you see these photos, I want, yeah, thank you. I would like also to say a few words about the work in Kherson. When the Russians ruined the dam, we spent one of the days. We spent there near 10 days, as I remember, but we spent one of the days on a boat together with two twin brothers, Boris and Yuri. They were near 50 years old. This case is really very important for me because if we talk about forms of fixation, in my opinion, a video fixation is much more important in this case. But I have a text and photos. Now I will try to show it according to the storyline. First, we sail with them on a boat to the area of Kherson, completely surrounded by water. The goal of the aim of the brothers is to evacuate a woman in a wheelchair. Yes, it's an old woman in a wheelchair. And this is the time when the water is lower than it was on the first day. And we see that during this time, the leaves on the trees, flowers have rotted. And many plants have died. We are sailing on the Dnipro. Explosions can be heard nearby. As the Russians, despite their flooding, shelled Kherson daily, every day, every time. Next, we go through this area. There is a steam on one of the streets. So the guys, twin brothers, jump out and of the boat, and you can see it on one of the pictures. They also have the provisions for the locals who have been living without any conditions for several days, and cook food on the grill for the whole house. At the end, we evacuate Mrs. Clarinda. It's her name, Mrs. Clarinda, very special name. Mrs. Clarinda in a wheelchair from the third floor. When we moved her and start to go away, she asked to stop under a really nice white blossom tree. She said, I didn't leave my house, my apartment for 10 years, really 10 years. I saw this tree through the window for 10 years. Bye-bye, my dear tree. Bye-bye, my dear tree. I will never see you again. Can you imagine a video? Yes. The story ends with her arriving by boat to a big land. Yes. Then she is taken to Kyiv. And the story was well structured. It was emotional. Yes, there were a lot of nice, interesting characters and so on. However, in my opinion, a video would be a stronger form of expression in this case. From the same Kherson, my random video in Instagram from a bot where people save a cat in water became viral and got into many media. Please show this picture, a cat in the water. I have to say that it was not possible to write a better text about what happened. The video speaks for itself.
Yeah. Это наш.
Це наш.
Наш котик. Боже, дивись, який він.
Диви, біднючка. Спокійний, бідняга. Він
Therefore, I will say that contemporary documentarians, in my opinion, should not limit themselves to one genre and on one form of fixation. They should be prepared for the fact that some topics are and some events will be better recorded in the forms of photos or video or in other forms. It's great to have someone with camera nearby, but that's not always the case. And we should understand the role of social media, yes, because I shared this video on a board just at that after I shot it, and it was shared for 100,000 times, and it was really important, I think, because after that after a lot of videos flooded Kherson, there were a video by volunteers, by soldiers, by journalists. There were really a lot of support of Kherson people, Kherson animals, and something like this. The main thing in this case, in my opinion, is not to lose the moment. And at the end, therefore, I will tell you about another project. On Christmas 2022, we were in Vulliamy, it's Zaporizhia direction. The units that are fighting here are from Carpathians, my Carpathians, I'm also from Carpathians, and in Carpathians, the traditions of celebrating Christmas are very deep and really powerful. When we arrived, the fighters had traditional dishes, kutya and uzvar, and also they wrote the new lyrics to the old carol sung by their ancestors. Please show this video. It's not it's not a video of this carol, new carol, but it's an old carol, but it's also interesting for me. I think so.
Звізда ясна, на весь світ засіяла, над вертепом звізда ясна, на весь світ засіяла, де Христос родився, Діви воплотився, як чоловік з пеленами, у Бога вповився, як чоловік з пеленами, у Бога вповився, пастушки з ягнятком, перед тим дитятком, на колінця припадаю, царя Бога вихваляю, на колінця припадаю, царя Бога вихваляю, просим тебе, царю, небесний владарю, даруй літа щасливії, цьому дому господарю, даруй літа щасливії, цьому дому господарю, Боже, Боже, поляни ждати, щоб прийти до неї, заколядувати, щоб прийти до неї, заколядувати. Вона дістала, яка не бувала, над вертепом звізда ясна, на весь світ засіяла.
I couldn't find this carol about current events, Putin and war, but Danilo Paulo have it. Okay. The following year, 2023, we went in the same direction again and recorded by camera, professional camera, the same guys. And we also went to the relatives of these soldiers and filmed them celebrating in Carpathians, yes, 1,000 kilometers from Gulyaipole, and the other side of Ukraine. And I plan to continue this project and capture Christmas in the next years. In this case, as humanity scholar, I'm interested in the change of the values, how war experience affect deeper structures. Also, I want to preserve the memory of these beautiful guys. And to sum up, I want to say that the forms of fixation can be different. However, the main goal for me is to show the truth, not to harm the characters, because the person for me is the center of any story, and also preserve the facts and emotions for the future, which may be better than the present.
Thank you, Myroslav,
Thank you.
and thank you for your investment as an artist, as a writer, into making these stories from the frontline heard. It is very important. I just want to remind that you may pose your questions in the comment section in Zoom, and we will be able to discuss them. Also, I want to say that there So many Ukrainian creatives and people of culture who really changed their way of living, who joined the military, or who decided to switch to non-fiction just to cover the Russian-Ukrainian war. And also there are many of those whom we lost, and it is my message to our international audience, please check the project which is entitled People of Culture Taken Away by the War. We are constantly covering such people and making their profiles just to make their voices heard and make their work visible. Right now we will have a very brief break up to 10 minutes and then we will continue our conference. So please stay with us, but just grab a cup of tea and then we will continue. Thank you. Dear audience, we continue our today's discussion about the wartime documentation, memory and testimonies. And I would like to introduce you our final speaker, who is Rostyslav Semkiv. He holds a PhD in literature and he is an associate professor at Volodymyr Morinets Department of Literature at Kyiv-Mogila Academy. Rostyslav is also a writer and he authored several books on literature, Ukrainian, but also foreign literature. And his today's talk is entitled Diaries of War, Between Analytics and Emotion. Rostyslav, I invite you.
Thank you. So it's just another form of fixation of any experience, and diaries are very common and very important in the culture whole. And that's the diary itself. It's a non-fiction genre of day-by-day events fixation, and it is common to many people to keep diary for a long time. For example, Franz Kafka kept his diary for more than 10 years, since 1910 till 1923, and Vladimir Vinnichenko was even more persistent and went along with his diary for almost 40 years, from 1911 till 1951. Till the final year of his life. And famous Ukrainian culture promoter Evgen Chikolenko kept his diary since 1907 till the his final year, 1929. But he also wrote memoirs of his early life from the birth in 1861 to 1907. The last example is quite exceptional, as much as more people start their diaries only during the extraordinary periods of their lives. And they are trying to fix and comprehend the most important things in their biographies. Meanwhile, the need of such fixation and of diaries sharpens in the extreme moments, especially connected with danger, when the end of human life appears as disastrous in disastrous proximity. In such moments, diary emerges as a kind of a message, a letter to next generations, and aims to summarize the harsh experiences, then to catch the moment of still presence, then to survive nearby death by a story, because it is thought about as a story that can survive and can carry on up to the death of a writer. And also its function to warn future beings, future living beings, with the horrible events of the past. Such are, for example, diaries of Holocaust, and, for example, the diary of a young girl by Anne Frank, that was kept during Nazi occupation for 2 years. Therefore, the outburst of diary writing in nowadays Ukraine is quite understandable, and that process began already during the days of Revolution of Dignity, in the end of 2013, and with the beginning of Russian aggression against Ukraine in in spring of 2014. So I mean that since that time we have a number of diaries and a number of diaries published. For example, the main about Maidan, the main mainly known diaries are the Diary of Maidan and War by Andrei Kurkov and Ukrainian Maidan, Russian War, the Chronicle and Analysis of Revolution of Dignity by Mikhailo Vinnytsky. These were first diaries about Revolution of Dignity, and they were published respectively in 2015 to 2019. In fact, even these two diaries or chronicles, they different, and they have this difference between more personal and thus more emotional attitude and more analytical chronicle. Since 2014, more diaries were published as books, and the most known are the Diary of a Military Doctor by Viktor Chernyenko and the Diary of an Illegal Soldier by Olena Bilozerska. But also some important diaries were written by Gennady Kharchenko, Alexander Mamaly, Nazar Rozlutsky, Irina Volk, some others, and there are also quite resonant diary-like non-fiction books of short essays as 0 Point by Artem Chekh and The Torture Camp on Paradise Street by Stanislav Aseyev. Diary writing became especially intensive since the full-scale Russian invasion in February 2022, and we can name nearly 24 of already published books written by Daria Bura, Anatoly Dnistrovy, Igor Kurylets, Andrei Kurkov, Alexander Mekhet, Sergei Rudenko, Volodymyr Vakulenko, who died, was killed, and these are just several to the most important. There is also a visual diary of One Day in War by Yulia Veretelnyk. And I'd say just a couple of words about the three diaries I want to enlighten. This is The Fight for Life diary of 2022 by Anatoly Dnistrovy. Job's Call Sign Chronicles of the Invasion, in English translation it is The Language of War by Alexander Mekhet, and Ukraine in Flames, 100 Days of Resistance by Lyudmila Ternashenska. These books represent three different approaches to speak about the events witnessed by their authors. The Fight for Life by Anatoly Dnistrovy, it's a careful, almost day-by-day chronicle of events during the beginning of the invasion, and it is a huge 480 pages volume. And there is another book that covers the next year, the previous year, 2023. It is not published yet, but it will be published soon. And in this his volume, the author combines the actual events witnessed by himself, also news coverage, analytical entries from various observers, as for example Vitaly Portnikov, and also his own reflections. And these reflections are also quite profound, since Anatoly Dnistrovy was a political analytic for a long time and has a rich experience in the field. And also he works as an analytic for Ukrainian armed forces now, and thus in his diary he's not so much about emotions, but about analysis and about the careful fixation of the events from different polyphonical sources. This is just plenty of information to think about. and it is also rather systematic, so it's good source for the comprehension of these events of the war. I won't quote to spare the time, but in fact it's easy to find some quotations and some quotations about from these books in the networks. The next book, The Language of War, by Alexander Mehet, displays completely another way of events fixation, and the author himself underlines in the foreword that his book won't be a careful account, which would be impossible to endure, yes, because the experience is too harsh, but rather it would be a collage of various facts and observations. Thus, this book has three different components. First, it's a number of short essays, which are themselves more or less fragmented and reflect the attitude of the author to various events. They are very personal, these personal observations, and so quite emotional. Alongside with these essays, the book contains also 4 interviews that illustrate the main story, and also 4 episodes of fragmented chronicle, as the author names it, with a direct depiction of Russian war crimes. These fragmented chronicles, they are quite neutral in style, but because of the horrors they depict, their neutrality turns into intense emotional blow. And the whole book is a powerful accusation of these imperial and human policies of Russia. And the third book, Ukraine in Flames, by Lyudmila Tarnashenskaya, it is also a diary, but it is quite specific. This book is arranged as a dialogue in which day-by-day events of the current war is intermingled with the appropriate passages from Alexander Dovzhenko's novel with the same title, Ukraine in Flames. Lyudmila Tarnashenskaya is a professor of Ukrainian literature, and so she researches the Ukrainian literary history of the 20th century, and it is possible to find these parallels, and these parallels she finds between the events of these first 100 days of this war and those of Nazist invasion. They are quite impressive because the similarities are striking. This way, from the literary analysis, we pass to deeper understanding of the Nazism, of the contemporary Russian politics, and this observation moves us to the strong emotional response. All 3 books, which I mentioned, demonstrate various ways to represent the tragic events of Russian-Ukrainian war, and I have no doubt that the contemporary Ukrainian non-fiction literature is in the process of elaboration of quite a new approach or approaches to such representation in its urge to condemn the atrocities and speak up about the heroism of warriors and also the common people which had to survive during these harsh years of struggle. Meanwhile, there is one more very huge diary-like, though non-systematic compendium of texts which witness about these war events, and it is in social networks. Since the beginning of the invasion, many of our co-citizens wrote about all dramatic and even tragic things which happened with them and their relatives, acquaintances in Facebook, Twitter, Telegram profiles, and it's one enormous electronic diary. It is the most emotional, and but it is also the most exact chronicle. It also should be somehow comprehended in future, and it's a task for further researchers. Thank you.
Thank you, Rostyslav, for your input and for this very important emphasis on the wartime diaries, which will definitely serve as the documents and probably the base for the new artworks which are to come. I want again to thank you, to say thank you to all our panelists, and we have one question from our audience. It is the question from Askold Melnichuk, who also was the participant of one of our events, and I will read it for everybody. So we have heard about how thoroughly this horrific war has been documented. How do the panelists hope these documents will be used for war crimes trials, for pedagogical purposes, etc.? And how do they expect to be used? This is a particularly dark moment in the world, with the word genocide coming up in reference to two ongoing conflicts. Yet history suggests we should not put too much hope in expecting justice via the courts. What other ways may justice be pursued? I want to give the opportunity to answer to Ed, first of all.
Thank you, Bohdana. Thank you, Askot. We might as well start with a big one, to which really we don't know the answer, but we must try out of respect for your question because it's crucial. Ideally, what should go into the courts of law, however they emerge, belong in the courts of law, as I try to sort of give some idea about how that might or might not happen. But you're absolutely right. Since when did the survivors of a calamity such as this ever feel that their story was really told? For what it's worth, the survivors of the Bosnian carnage are lost, scattered and shattered, not only geographically all over the world as refugees, but in history, because really their story was not told, because it's been challenged not least by deniers. Before fake news on the internet, we had a whole lot of people who decided that I fabricated the concentration camps. And I won't bore you with it now, but they decided we made it all up. And they're all over the internet now. One of them was the distinguished Noam Chomsky. Every time they found a mass grave near the camp, I wrote him an email saying, Professor Chomsky, if I fabricated the story, that was the word he used. It's a serious word in my profession. Who's in the effing mass graves? He never replied, of course. So to answer your question, in literature, I mean, and thank you for this wonderful contribution about diaries, because this is absolutely crucial. This conflagration in Ukraine is being recorded, and I'm very grateful for this idea of the social networks as an electronic diary. I cannot and don't want to do social media, but of course this is happening. But I think Rostyslav is absolutely right. You know, a literature will come out of this, and that exists for and of itself. It's literature. It can be as didactic or not as it wants and intends to be, but the story will be told. So there's the body of testimony, to use the title of our project today, and there is the body of evidence for the courts. But in between those, and this is where I'll try and answer your question, perhaps by passing it on to my good colleagues on the panel, in between literature and legal evidence is this other thing called collective memory, and the experience of memory as verbalized, as filmed, as photographed, as we've seen so wonderfully this evening, and in many other places, very many other places. And that's part of the affirmation of what you call Nazia. That's the affirmation of the political identity and cultural identity that the Russians insist does not exist. And I think maybe the real value of what we hope will come out of this is of course, literature on the one hand, and of course, cinema and so on, art, diaries, and legal evidence. But most importantly, there will be this accumulation of almost testimony, and perhaps the most important of it, and I loved Roman's contribution about listening to children rather than talking to them. And I think perhaps the most important thing will be almost like a sort of a DNA of testimony and experience in and out from your struggle for freedom and independence, and the affirmation of your revolutionary nationalism, your liberal, radical nationalism, which will create, hopefully, Askold, a kind of something that's between literature and legal evidence, which is actually a sort of a thriving cultural memory that will be passed on in ways that we cannot foresee from generation to generation as your country thrives from this tribulation to its ultimate affirmation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you for your input into our today's discussion.
Oh,
it's my honor.
If I can add, then literature is always about experience, and we can rely on the previous experience. How all of those fixations in memoirs and diaries of Holocaust survivors and non-survivors were used. So we can do the same, and there are many ways, but the main thing is that it helps many voices to be present. Yes, and it's quite these all fixations, videos and photos and texts. The answer to the main question in the essay of Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, can the subaltern speak? Yes, and the subaltern cannot speak. And if we can speak through these various texts, then we overthrow this subaltern status, and it's a victory by itself. It's very important.
And thank you, Askold, for the question. And if I can just very briefly, again, talking about children, first of all, adding to the story of the diaries, I think we all are aware of, there was a diary by Yeva Skaletska from Kharkiv that became very well known because it was an audio book was made of it by Keira Knightley, and the English-speaking world found out about a child's perspective on the war. The book was called "You Don't Know What War Is," so there's that kind of direct result almost immediately. And language, as we know, in Ukraine has always been an issue, continues to be an issue, the Ukrainian and the Russian question. And I'm thinking here how the spontaneity of a child can address this question without even thinking about it. And I'm thinking here again, Askold, who we took to Bucha after its liberation, and he saw the destroyed houses and the mass graves and the church with bullet holes, and his words, and you could see how angry he was. His words were, yeah, they came to liberate us, but he said it in Russian. And as every kid in Kyiv, of course, knows Russian, he chose Russian to say that. They came to liberate us. And the last thing that I'd like to say is, thinking of David, again, David Riefen, we had an opportunity to be with David, and Askold was sitting there, and we were talking about things. And David then said something which I very much agree with. You know, you're talking, everyone's talking about canceling Bulgakov or other Russian writers and Dostoevsky. You know, I get what you're doing. And of course, it'll be up to Askold's generation to think of how, if we do come back to reading Russian literature 30 years from now, it'll be up to those kids to decide whether they'll be doing it. So that's that living memory that Ed, I think, is talking about. How will these kids retain with them the memory of the tragedy that is happening now? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Askold, for this significant and really difficult question. Thank you, the previous speakers. I will try to answer it in several ways.
The first way is about that we, as war documentarians and as militaries who write their diaries and not militaries who write about the war, I like to read the books, the novels about the Second World War, the First World War, and when I was on the front line, I understood that there I see some emotions that I have never seen before. It's really, really interesting, not just interesting, yes, in a plot, like a plot, but in emotional, philosophical terms, really, really unique emotions. And when we make all these fixations, we make a fixation, not just the facts, the names, battles, so on. We make a fixation of very unique emotions first. Second, if to talk about the influence of this fixation in future, we can talk about the influence of this fixation nowadays. We can talk about the, for example, everybody knows the movie by Mstislav Chernov, 20 Days in Mariupol, how it make the influence around the world. And we know about this movie was launched several months ago in the world, in Ukraine maybe 1 year ago, and they won Oscar and BAFTA and so on. But we should remember the photo by Evgeny Maloletka, the photo of, it was made on 9th of March 2022. It's a photo from bombed maternity hospital, and it's a photo of a pregnant woman, 32 years old, Irina Kalinina, and it's a real evidence of a war crime. And I had a lot of conversations with Evgeny, because now we are, we have one project together. And he said about this influence of this photo. A day before this photo, he shared this photo in Instagram, and it was shared in Associated Press and press around the world. How powerful was this photo? It was just an act that changed everything. This photo for many people around the world, it was for many people it was the first evidence of Russia's crimes, and Russian propaganda tried to do everything to say that it's fake and something like this. But this photo, this fixation, I think that in some terms it changed these discourses of Russian, that was Russian discourses. It's the second thing, and I forgot I wanted. The third thing. If we talk about books, books cannot be the evidences in courts. Yes. Real evidences, no, it's there is another procedure, and at knows it's exactly. But book text is the most influential way to make the reader's reflection and emotion. And I believe then maybe in 10 years there will be a court in Hague or Mariupol or another city, and there will be a lot of these discourses that these guys, they didn't know anything about Putin's wars and something like this. And I think that there in Netherlands, in the bookshops of Netherlands, there should be a lot of books by Ukrainian authors, yes,
and this book should renew this emotion, renew these truths. And for me, it's really important. And the last thing, sorry for so long speech, it's like Askol Melnichuk's novel. Very often they make a question, yes? For us nowadays, as war documentarians, humanity studies professors, military, civilians, they may aim to make these questions to foreigners, yes? Just to make this question. It's very important.
And that's just music. I should have mentioned this before. Nobody's mentioned music. There's I'm not going to go on about this, but there's a musical renaissance going on in Ukraine at the moment, in opera, in jazz, in folk, in electronica, in all these things. That's going to be a huge cultural testimony to your struggle. In 10 years' time, people will look back on this remarkable musical moment in Ukraine.
Unfortunately, we ran out of time, so it is my time to say my final remarks, and I want to express my gratitude to all our wonderful panelists. And today we had Ed Vulliamy, we had Roman Veretelnyk, Myroslav Laiuk, and Rostyslav Semkiv. I want also to say thank you to our audience of all the days of these events, which were organized by Kyiv-Mogila Business School and the Volodymyr Moranets Department of Literature of Kyiv-Mogila Academy. Now I want to pass the mic to the organizers to the closing remarks.
Okay, thank you, dear Bohdana. I will be brief, so thank you so much for this thoughtful and very important and topical discussions. And I would like also to say that we already have 85,000 hryvnias for quadricycle for our graduate Timur, and we need 400,000 hryvnias, so keep supporting Ukraine, keep donating, and thank you for your presence, and thank you for being with us. Bye.